If you're having canapes, as I showed you last week, or an outdoor barbecue, then the thing to do is to set fire to all the houses in the street. This will stir up anti-communist hatred, and your neighbors will be right with you as you organize counter-revolutionary terror.
Horseshoe theory. The concept of the radical left is seemingly identical to the radical right. Is there any merit to this concept? Or is it a pile of horse shit rather than a pile of horseshoes, I suppose? What most people posit when they describe horseshoe theory is that the extreme left and the extreme right are equally authoritarian and behave in complementary ways, due to this shared propensity towards authoritarianism. But is there any evidence for that? First, we need to understand what authoritarianism is, and generally speaking, it's deference towards authority. And beginning from that standpoint, and digging into how we have classically identified authoritarianism in the mainstream, for most of its history, it has been almost dogmatically referred to as an exclusively right-leaning trait. However, horseshoe theory posits to the contrary, that there are left-leaning extremists, and that they are more or less identical in terms of their similar levels of authoritarianism as to the right. But is there any evidence for this? In order to posit something as a theory, you need to have available data. Let's then delve into the data by examining the history of the study of authoritarianism and see what we can find out from those data about what exactly authoritarianism is and if there seems to be any sort of difference between the right and the left when it comes to this trait. Much of what we will be looking at today comes from an overview of research on authoritarianism from Rosier and Willig, 2002, as always cited below. Theodor Adorno and his colleagues at the University of California, after he left the Frankfurt School in Germany, proposed the F scale in 1950. At a time when the world was in its entirety, but particularly within the microcosm that is the social sciences, obsessed with Hitler and Nazism. How could World War II possibly have come about? This was something that concerned social scientists and researchers in general for decades. Years before Milgram originally published his revolutionary research on the power of authority on behavior, which was looking at the same kind of thing, Adorno and his colleagues came up with a handy tool to seek out the authoritarian where you find him. And potential authoritarians, meaning people that we think maybe just become authoritarian in the future, in order to nip any potential for American fascism to take hold in the bud. Now, Adorno, as I've mentioned, came from the famous, or more accurately infamous, Frankfurt School, and to some degree, yes, he did witness Nazism to the first hand. To say that he and his colleagues thereby were not kind of biased, or at least more biased than the average researcher then, is an understatement. On top of fleeing the Nazis, Adorno was also, as most of his colleagues were as well, more socialist or communist leaning, or at least socialist or communist sympathizing. I don't say that without proof. The proof is in the pudding, or more accurately in the fact that Adorno and many of his colleagues would refuse to sign an anti-communist oath of loyalty to the United States, and that's why around the same time his F scale, his fascist scale, came under some fire, as the looming threat within the mainstream cultural zeitgeist oscillated from a fascistic one to a communistic one, and affected the F scale indirectly as, I mentioned, 45 researchers at the University of California were temporarily stripped of their positions within the university after being unwilling to sign that anti-communist oath of loyalty to the United States. Adorno himself did not sign it and instead returned to Germany, where he attempted to re-establish the Frankfurt School. But outside of Adorno, others, such as M. Brewster Smith, who published a glowing review of Adorno's F-scale, and who was himself a member of the Young Communist League, was pretty much permanently blacklisted from publication in academia. I'm not saying that's right, I'm saying that was the McCarthyist era. And if you want to make claims about how the Frankfurt School was in no way socialist or communist, then ask yourself why they refused to sign that oath. But that's not a real problem I have with the F-scale. I mean, that's external. That has nothing to do with scientific instrumentation. It is not a very good instrument. But why is it not a very good instrument, Aiden? Let's actually look at the instrument itself. It's comprised of several different categories which Adorno posited were comprised aspects of authoritarianism. All of these together defined the authoritarian. Keep that in mind as I go through the things I'm about to say. 1. Conventionalism, which is a rigid adherence to conventional middle-class values. 2. Authoritarian submission, which is a submissive, uncritical attitude towards an idealized moral authority within the group, or authorities. 3. Authoritarian aggression, which is a tendency to be on the lookout for people who violate any conventional attitudes or values, and to condemn, reject, and punish them. 4. Anti-introception, which is an opposition to the subjective, the imaginative, and the tender-minded. This is rigidity of thought. 6. Power and toughness, which is a preoccupation with the dominant submission or strong-weak or leader-follower dimensions. 7. Destructiveness and cynicism, which is a generalized hostility, vilification of the human as inherently bad. 8. Projectivity, the disposition to believe that the world is wild and dangerous, and that wild and dangerous things go on within it. And 9. A preoccupation with sex, with an exaggerated concern with sexual, quote, goings-on. Based on their theoretical bases, which arose from the works of Freud and Marx, Adorno and his colleagues suggested that this was an immutable trait that developed based on family structure during adolescence. In other words, however your family was as a kid determined whether or not you would be a fascist. If you watched my previous video, you might now get an idea as to where I was coming from with some of these notions that the left has for a long time wanted to insert itself into family structure. But hey, we don't have any evidence yet, so let's keep going. What we do have evidence of, however, is that what I just described, those 9 dimensions, doesn't really seem to match up with a very general definition of what authoritarianism is. There are a lot of things in there, but do all of them apply to that general concept of authoritarianism? I would argue no, and that's because I'm not the only one. Many people have said the same thing. It looks like you're looking at a lot of factors, not just authoritarianism. And it's one of many reasons why this instrument came under significant fire.
You see, us foreign squads are a bit like taxmen, sir. Everyone hates us, but we're just doing our job, ain't we, lads?
My heart bleeds for you.
Well, sir, we aim to please.
Just to be more clear, let me use another more strict definition of authoritarianism. The one here from dictionary.com is pretty much okay as far as I can tell. It states that authoritarianism is favoring complete obedience or subjugation to authority as opposed to individual freedom. Again, that is in opposition to many of the items that are included on that scale. While there are items that specifically address authoritarianism and conformity, not all of them do. That means there's probably spurious pieces of data that are being included in what was being called the F scale, even early on, outside of that obvious flaw. Other researchers, such as Cohn in 1953, noted that Adorno and his cohort in their development of this instrument failed to reverse code their items, and given that people who are truly authoritarian would likely acquiesce to a positively worded item, that is, that if a researcher tells you,
My message is simple. Jews, homosexuals, Mexicans, Arabs, and all kinds of different chanks stink, and I hate them.
well, if you tend to be authoritarian, you're gonna go along with whatever the researcher said, regardless of whether or not you actually agree with it. And that's precisely the way that this instrument was worded. Every question is phrased in a positive, such as, Jews are greedy, rather than Jews are charitable. And if people are authoritarian, then they will tend to acquiesce to authority figures, i.e. scientists in lab coats telling them to fill out this form. This, by the way, is not relegated to authoritarians and can happen to any of us at any point. It's something called acquiescence bias, and it's something that researchers always have to be aware of and careful to note when they conduct research using Likert-type instruments. The easiest way to account for this is to reverse code your questions. So some questions say Jews are greedy, and some questions say Jews are charitable, and you can see if they match up. If they don't match up, or if there is a little bit of spuriousness of the answers, well, then we can start to say maybe something weird was going on. There was acquiescence bias, or the person was just simply answering yes to every question. That's how we account for error in some of our data collection.
These questions are really personal. Are you sure this is anonymous?
Yeah, they're just practice evaluations for my psych class. All right, who did a butt?
They're boobs. And I don't know.
And we found this very early on when assessing the F-scale. As early as 1955, Bass found that when he gave a second F-scale test to the same set of students with the questions negatively coded, it reduced the reliability of the instrument by a significant degree, from 0.81 on average between items to 0.50. indicating that the F-scale was potentially just measuring a tendency to acquiesce to whatever they thought that the researcher wanted to hear, rather than being an indicator of a fascistic personality. Extensive research from Dr. Douglas Jackson and his cohorts consistently over the next couple of decades confirmed the suspicions of Bass in that the F-scale was clearly not measuring what it was intended to measure, but was instead really measuring sort of a propensity towards acquiescence bias. But that alone is not why I believe the F-scale was abandoned, and let me be very clear, no one in their right mind uses this instrument anymore. No, I think that the F-scale was abandoned by social scientists at large because it had a suspicious relationship with communism, which was at odds with the very purpose for which the scale was developed.
Filthy bastard commies! I hate them! I hate them! Ah!
Adorno and his pals developed this scale in order to identify fascists, because he was afraid of fascism becoming a trend in America. And when it turned out that his fascist scale also identified communists in a more similar direction than it did the average Joe, well, that just cannot be tolerated, so we better abandon that darn F-scale, which is exactly what they did. Thelma Coulter, in her doctoral thesis under the tutelage of Dr. Hans Eysenck, in 1953 administered the F-scale to 43 self-identified fascists, 43 identified members of the Communist Party, and a group of politically self-identified neutral soldiers. The fascists scored an average of 5.3 on the scale, but the communist averaged 3.1 on the scale. Seems to be a big difference between the two until you note that the politically neutral group rated an average of 2.5. So while not massively different, Coulter's data gave us an original initial idea that communists rated higher on the F-scale than did the average person. Was it identical? No, but it was raised. And that just could not be allowed. Because remember, at this point in time, it was common belief, as it is by the way today, by many, that left-wing people cannot hold any authoritarian views. So this finding was abhorrent to them. And thus Coulter's initial findings were pretty much ignored, if not outright lambasted and attacked for 20 years in academia. Researchers from the 1960s through the early 1980s absolutely refused to accept any criticisms of the F-scale. But by the early 1980s, the F-scale criticisms had reached a breaking point. And it's really the last time that you will see any research published on it, because it had become abandoned. That didn't mean it died, it merely was reborn in the form of right-wing authoritarianism, a scale highly based on the F instrument, but somewhat different. And that, again, was only after the measurement had not only been shown to be a measure that was assessing acquiescence over fascism, but further, was more related to communism than it was with the politics of the average person. What we ended up with in result is Altmaier's, beginning in 1981, attempts to patch up what was left of the failed F-scale with his right-wing authoritarian instrument. And despite its continual use in modern social science research, it falls into many of the same, well, pitfalls, although not as many as its predecessor, the F-scale. Unlike the original F-scale, it includes both positive and negatively coded questions, and remains reliable over time. Meaning if you take it today, and you take it a year from now, your scores on right-wing authoritarianism are likely to be fairly similar. But again, the problem becomes, is this actually measuring authoritarianism, or is it measuring something else? And if it's measuring something else, what is it measuring? If there is a horseshoe theory, then we would expect there to be left-wing authoritarianism, right? And that it would be more or less identical to right-wing authoritarianism. Well, Altmaier himself, years after his original publication in 1996, stated, "Is there an authoritarian of the left? No, not if you require scientific evidence. Lots of people have looked in several different ways in several different countries for this creature of lore, but no one has found it yet." That's page 229. And well, Altmaier abandoned the family-based premises of Adorno and his colleagues in their F-scale in suggesting that the RWA is not based on child-rearing and family structure from the Freudian tradition, but is rather a generalized personality trait, something that's been confirmed by the fact that we do find it is heritable. It continues to be used to this day, despite the continual criticism that this particular instrument is not necessarily measuring authoritarianism, but generalized conservatism. RWA and the F-scale have been critiqued for a long time. Even during the 1980s, the RWA was suspect to other researchers, such as Dr. John Ray, who contended as early as 1973 that half of all of the studies under the F-scale upon which RWA is based was comprised of left-leaning individuals when it came to their voting behavior. That is, that people may have rated high on authoritarianism, but half of them tended to vote left, at least in Ray's proposal. His research was pretty much lambasted. Not really with data to its contrary, but more with the kind of academic philosophical rap battles of which I am so fond, particularly between Ray and Altmaier. Specifically, Ray contended that Altmaier's scale was mostly just a scale of conservative beliefs and not of authoritarianism, and that the two were mutually exclusive tendencies, meaning that you could be conservative and authoritarian, or you could be conservative and not authoritarian, or authoritarian and not conservative. Altmaier didn't like this so much. But in Ray's 1979 study of English, Australian, and Scottish populations, he found that the F-scale was unrelated to other measures of politically conservative ideology when assessing mere beliefs in contrast to voting behavior. In other words, he actually had some support for his hypothesis. He contended that this tendency is because people who respect authority figures do not also themselves necessarily desire to be authority figures, and thus both the right-wing authoritarian instrument and the F-scale may be intrinsically flawed. Dr. Hans Eysenck conducted extensive research indicating that what the F-scale was really measuring was not a left versus right dichotomy, but rather something that he called tough-mindedness. According to his theory, originally posited in 1956, fascists are tough-minded and conservative, communists are tough-minded and radical, and liberals in the traditional European sense of the term, are tender-minded and neither radical nor conservative. Eysenck stated, quote, "Communists make almost as high scores on this scale as fascists." He and Coulter, further in 1972, found that moderates forwarded lower tough-mindedness scores, while extremists, specifically communists and fascists, forwarded higher reports of the trait of tough-mindedness. This study was criticized in and of itself because they found a lower than average report of the F-scale among moderates. But I question if that is a failure of Eysenck's data or a failure of the F-scale in and of itself. And that wasn't really addressed at the time, nor has it been thoroughly to this day. What I mean by all of that is this. Eysenck and his colleagues had a pretty basic proposal. Communists and fascists are not cut from the same cloth. They are clearly different. But both fascists and communists share this trait of tough-mindedness, which may to the outside observer make them appear to be heavily similar. And while they do share that trait, they are distinct and disparate from one another. But Eysenck was not the only one to criticize the F-scale and the RWA. Others, including Rokeach and Hanley in 1956, suggested that the different sort of findings that Eysenck and his colleagues found was a function of the fact that their scale included anti-religious items, while the F-scale included pro-religious items, essentially equating religiosity with authoritarianism and not recognizing that the F-scale is not measuring authoritarianism so much as it is measuring any sort of non-left-leaning ideology in aggregate, as the inclusion of anti-religious items indicated. That is, the F-scale includes a lot of items asking about the belief in God, and when Eysenck removed those items and included anti-religious items into their version of the scale, again, reverse coding, they found that, well, as they anticipated, that communists and fascists had similar scores of the tough-mindedness measure of the instrument. If your scale only works when you include something that is not inherently related to the thing that you're trying to measure, maybe there's a problem with your instrument. But in response, Rokeach in 1960 developed a dogmatism scale that was found to be highly related to right-wing authoritarianism and was found equally in both communists and fascists, although other studies have found conflicting results, leading his measurement of dogmatism to remain somewhat up in the air in its own validity. Christie, 1956, outright described Eysenck's findings as, quote, abuses of psychology, mostly because he found non-partisans to be less authoritarian than partisans. Well, Christie, isn't that what you would have expected? I'm not irritated by ignorance, but when I start to look at these scientists who seem to be intentionally stupid, just pretending to be
When you say other people are retarded, it means that your mom actually gave birth to the wrong baby. Because you don't ever have the rights to judge people when your dick is not even existing.
well then I start to get a little bit irritated. Because I know that you know better. And other people knew that they knew better. For example, Rokich's 1960 research on dogmatism found that communists were the most egalitarian out of liberals and conservatives in every group assessed, and his study caught some flack of its own for that. At this point, it looks like the entire debate on this ideal of the F scale, or whether or not there actually could be something such as left-wing authoritarianism, had just become nothing more than nonsense, academic shit-flinging. Specifically, Sills, a political scientist, posited in a chapter published in 1954 that the entire debate was an absurdist one, based on a reduction of complex political ideology into a dichotomistic trait, for the direct purpose of forwarding a political movement, one or the other, stating of the F factor that the failure to discriminate the substantially different types of outlook, which could be called liberal, collectivist, radical, Marxist, etc., is not just the outcome of the deficiency of the questionnaires technique in general, nor does it arise from carelessness. It flows from the author's failure to perceive the distinction between totalitarian Leninism, humanitarianism, and New Deal interventionalism. Page 30. And ultimately, he concluded that the F-scale and research regarding it was, quote, a product of wartime collaborations, communist tactics, and a well-intentioned lack of political and economic sophistication. The intellectual currency of American humanitarian liberalism for some years was much influenced by the Marxist outlook. Page 38. So, it's not just me. And his writings illustrate that even very early on, there was some significant criticism of the F-scale, particularly in terms of its political alignment. It seems, at least according to Sills, that from the beginning, RWA and the F-scale were supposed to be measuring an attempt at framing the right as bad and the left as good, without specific concerns for scientific legitimacy. This was about making a narrative, not about understanding the world from a science perspective. Regardless, others adamantly continued to refuse the existence of any potentially authoritarian-leaning propensities from the left, with Stone 1988 calling left-wing authoritarianism a myth, noting its old roots in Christian persecution complexes. After all, I mean, the Christians, they were never persecuted in any way, no, not at all. But the problem is, Stone makes numerous factual errors in his analysis, which were called out by Einsick in 1982. Stone's original article was published in 1981, he made an update in 1988, but Einsick's rebuttal still applies to both. Einsick's response to the notion posited by Stone that left-wing authoritarianism is a myth and doesn't exist cites, in and of itself, Einsick's own research which provided significant support for left-wing authoritarianism. Stone further focuses on right-wing anti-Semitism without acknowledging that the existence of anti-Semitism is real in the Russian communist regime of the time in which his own data were being published. Stone makes no note of the tough-mindedness measures that had been conducted at that point, and its genetic factors which had also been analyzed at that point, and isolated as shown here by Eves and Einsick in 1974, 10 years prior. And generally, even by the early 1980s, both researchers and the public, or at least world governments, had come to accept the idea of tough-mindedness as being a trait measured by this authoritarian instrument over right or left-leaning exclusive indicators. Somehow Dr. Stone was the only one in the dark on this. But it goes to show that in spite of all evidence, it continued to be posited that there could be no such thing as left-wing authoritarianism. And he wasn't the only one. Altmaier originally also heavily denied the existence of left-wing authoritarianism. As I mentioned, by 1996, he posited that there is no authoritarian left. But the problem is that, okay, even if there is no authoritarian left, then what is the difference between right-wing authoritarianism and conservatism? And currently, I would say you'd be hard-pressed to find a researcher who could adequately explain the difference between the measurements of conservatism we typically use and right-wing authoritarianism in practice as to how they are applied to research. But in reality, just what is RWA? Are you measuring people who want to seize power over others, or people who want to maintain existing power that belongs to their in-group? And what do either one of those clearly distinct concepts inherently have to do with each other or with left-wing or right-wing ideology? So what the heck are we measuring here? Something intrinsically related to the right more than the left, or more generically to unilateral concepts of authoritarianism? At this point you might be asking, why are we measuring any of this bullcrap at all? It all seems pointless and broken and stupid, and you're really not wrong there. But we do have some rationales as to what we're trying to look at, even if we're not doing it very, let's just say, adequately. Specifically, we create measures for the purpose of generating greater understanding about social phenomena that we witness in an operationalized way. Operationalization allows for the replication and use of a single measurement across many different studies. A good instrument will report similar results across all of these different environments and conditions, making it reliable, and therefore we hope, through the crafting of a social science instrument, that it will not just be reliable, but that it will be reasonably representative of an accurate depiction or description of whatever phenomenon we are trying to measure. We can determine the robustness of an instrument through comparison in its implementation across different individuals, different settings, and across similar measures. In this way, we can judge a scale on its reliability and its validity. Reliability is simply a consistency of measurement. There are several types of reliability, including test, retest, split half, internal, and intercoder. But generally speaking, if a test is reliable, that means that you will get the same or very similar results today as you would a year from now. It's important to also note, however, that the reliability of an instrument is really more of a prerequisite in order for science to happen, rather than anything else. In other words, you need reliability first in order for anything else about your scientific test or instrument to have any meaning. It's much like how we often hear people say, something is statistically significant, when they are potentially just referring to what's called a p-value. And a p-value really only indicates that the results of a study are not due to random error. And that functionally means very little. You can have a p-value of 0.001, meaning you would only get a different result if you reconducted that test one time out of 1,000 retests. And in academic language, yes, that is statistically significant. But when we start to look at effect sizes, if the R value, the effect size, is similarly 0.001, it means, sure, it's doing something consistently, but nothing noticeable. Or what we would call, in colloquial terms, not significant. In terms of reliability, this means very little alone. If you were to drink vomit-inducing rotten salty cabbage water for a few weeks, coming out both ends like Old Faithful, and you lose weight as a result, you might think, well, there you go. When I drink this rotten cabbage water, I lose weight. Therefore, the rotten cabbage water and its magical properties are why I am losing weight. It's a reliable weight loss solution. Despite the fact that in reality, it's not the pungent cabbage water's magical components that were responsible, but merely its extreme salinity that caused you to lose water weight and to have problems with your digestive system. You can immediately see, though, however, how something being replicable does not necessarily mean that it's useful to try and understand why or how it is replicable. This is why a scale can be reliable and invalid. However, in contrast, a scale can never be unreliable and valid at the same time. As I said, reliability is consistency, and it is a requisite. Validity is the extent to which an instrument measures what it seeks to measure or claims to measure. There are many types of validity, including internal, external, concurrent, predictive, face, content, and construct. But the ones I'm going to focus on most here today are going to be construct validity and content validity. Content validity means that the scale includes all items or aspects that would measure a certain thing. And well, both in the F scale and in the revised RWA scale, sure, a lot of concepts are included, but the problem is that they include maybe too many concepts. They are measuring more than what they claim to be measuring. Their content validity has a boundary condition that exceeds the precise variable which it is attempting to measure. And how do we determine what an item should be in an instrument to measure what it's attempting to measure? Pretty simply through guessing. It's what we call face validity. Face validity is basically asking, do the items in this instrument appear to be measuring what we say they're measuring based on looking at them on their face? But there are other good ways to determine if an instrument is valid or not by assessing it in association and disassociation with other similar variables. In order to call an instrument adequate, it should be distinct but related to other instruments which are, well, related to it. So if right-wing authoritarianism is a good instrument, then it should be correlated highly to, let's say, left-wing authoritarianism. At least closely, right? After all, horseshoe theory suggests that left-wing and right-wing authoritarianism is more or less the same in terms of their support of role-oriented systems. But so far, we've seen no support of that. There appears to be no such existence of left-wing authoritarianism. Therefore, we have nothing to really base our analysis of right-wing authoritarianism in contrast or comparison to, because up to now, in terms of the research we've looked at, such an instrument has been outright lambasted as being an impossibility in the data. And when we look at the data, as we always do, given the renewal of interest in the right-wing authoritarian instrument in the 1980s through the 1990s, and ongoing through the dispute between Ray and Altmaier, meant that pretty much all of the research on the concept of a left-wing authoritarian instrument was effectively shut down before it could even get off the ground. Some studies attempted to differentiate the two as similar yet disparate, such as the work from Cohn, 1972, which described left and right political extremism on a rebellion to authoritarianism scale, and found little correlation between the rebellious and role-oriented loadings, indicating that left-leaning authoritarianism or rebellion was potentially a distinct measure from right-leaning authoritarianism and conservatism. However, when we look at these items in the scale, and probably a reason why this has been rarely mentioned in its 40 years of existence, is not just because of its moderate reliability, but because it does not contain questions of group acquiescence and purity that tend to lean more left, and only includes right-leaning purity questions. For example, there are several questions about the disgusting nature of sex crimes, but none that reverse code for, let's say, the disgusting nature of heterosexuality, which is not an unheard of thing today. So, again, it codes one way rather than the other, meaning it may have some flaws. I must note, however, that Altmaier himself did appear to be sincerely interested in finding out if such a thing as a left-wing authoritarian trait existed. As time passed, as in 1996, despite all of his criticisms of the existence of a left-wing authoritarian instrument, he attempted to create and define one for himself. Keep that in mind as we go forward. This is someone who doesn't believe this exists, and then went and tried to create a measurement for it. He did include left-leaning, tough-minded revolutionary items, being A high degree of submission to authorities who are dedicated to overthrowing the established authorities, B, general aggressiveness directed against the established authorities and against persons who are perceived to support those authorities, and C, adherence to the norms of behavior perceived to be endorsed by the authorities of a revolutionary movement, submission, aggression, and conventionalism. In other words, pretty much a mirror of the right-wing authoritarian instrument, but designed with left-wing authoritarians potentially in mind. Despite its moderate reliability, Altmaier could not identify a single participant within his sample who rated highly on this LWA instrument. But I would ask, maybe, just maybe, Altmaier, that's because a major part of your instrument relies on authority figures rather than the authority of the public opinion. If we look at left-leaning extremism today, such as was the case with the Covington Catholic castigation, was it politicians and thought leaders leading that cause, or was it the mere fact that left-leaning politics are, at this point, more common in the public perception and social spheres? I would also just like to see more studies conducted using this particular method with an updated instrument conducted again today, because the cultural milieu is significantly different now than it was in the 1990s when this was initially conducted. Conventionalism only applies when one's political party is in a significant position of power, as the left is currently, despite all of their claims to the contrary. And it was, however, to a lesser degree, 20 or so years ago. In many ways, the left is trying to conserve its own belief systems and channels of influence, making them potentially far more prone to conventionalism today than they would have been in previous decades. What we call conservatism may right now actually define the left, as they are trying to conserve their own political position of power. But to further investigate the left-wing authoritarian instrument developed by Altmaier, Van Hill, Duriez, and Kasolka, 2006, developed a version of the instrument that focused only on aggression and submission to authority, without focusing on authority role figures exclusively, including items such as a revolutionary movement is justified in demanding obedience and conformity of its members. Despite any reference to conventionalism in their scale, the researchers found a strong convergent relationship between right-wing authoritarianism and left-wing authoritarianism. That is, in the right-wing authoritarian scale, when you take out one simple factor that is the concept of conventionalism, be it religious or social, right-wing authoritarianism and left-wing authoritarianism present very similarly. When looking specifically at submission and aggression, scores using this conformity measure, more extremist left-leaning individuals were significantly more aggressive and were more submissive at the same time than were moderates or extreme right-wingers. Whew, lad. That kind of flies in the face of your whole F-scale thing and your right-wing authoritarian instrument now, doesn't it? It's almost like if you care about construct validity and making sure that you're measuring what you claim that you're measuring, things don't always turn out in line with your political agenda now, do they? I always am trying to look for the truth in this stuff. So when things don't turn up my way, I will tell you guys, and I have in the past. And while I cannot speak to every specific scientist who has contributed to the wealth of knowledge and data involving the F-scale and the right-wing authoritarianism instrument, I can say pretty much without question, as we've covered, that Adorno and much of his cohort definitively did have a political agenda when they developed this. What I find most interesting, and what I think we should look at more closely here, is that while Van Hill et al. Found a correlation between the RWA and an LWA in moderate degrees, they found no such correlation between extremists of either political orientation. In other words, there isn't any good evidence to suggest that the left and the right are the same. Both can be authoritarian, yes, but they are inherently different in the manner in which they enact authoritarianism. Anyone of any orientation can hold authoritarian beliefs, but from the data we've seen, as lacking and as heavily skewed as it has been in one direction, this does not indicate that the left cannot be authoritarian, nor that the left-leaning authoritarian is identical to a right-leaning authoritarian. These are seemingly distinct concepts, and probably the reason why so much of this data has been so spurious for such a long time is because left-leaning authoritarianism is related but distinct from right-leaning authoritarianism. It is not a horseshoe, it is a distinct difference. And thus my point in describing all of this is that authoritarian and rebelliousness is neither inherently right nor left. Authoritarian and conservative might be more right, and authoritarian and rebellious might be more left. But these are distinct categories. They are not identical, they are not a horseshoe. They likely have things in common. Extremists on either side may tend to be more tough-minded, but while the left may lean towards the rebellious and the right lean towards the role orientation, this can change based on political atmospheres in terms of proclivity towards authoritarianism. At one point, the left was in power, and they would have tended to stray away from authoritarianism because it didn't suit their current needs. But right now, where they are in a position of lesser power, well, then they do tend towards more authoritarian sort of behaviors or beliefs. Authoritarianism is not inherently a right-wing concept, and the only way that one can arrive at such a conclusion is to use a broken, backwards, and completely debunked at this point instrument that depicts every member of the human race as at least slightly fascistic. But even that F-scale, that measurement developed by communists and socialists, or at least their sympathizers, that was made to push their political agenda, still finds in its own score that there is a higher propensity for authoritarianism in communists than there is in the average bear. I think ultimately the failure in these instruments is that they have really yet to recognize that authoritarianism itself is not aligned politically inherently, but rather is a function that is veritable based on that rebellion factor that Heaven and Connor proposed in their work all the way back in 1970. Both defer to authority figures, but one views itself as revolutionary while the other views itself as traditional. This is thereby not a horseshoe, but an axis of authoritarianism which does not meet itself in the middle. Despite decades of debate, almost every study that has been found or has found evidence for left-wing authoritarianism has been ignored or forgotten, despite them also seeming to indicate that it is a unique construct from right-wing authoritarianism. It does not appear to be the same thing. There is no evidence for Horseshoe, and yet the very idea that left-leaning ideologues can be authoritarian in aggression, tough-mindedness, and conformity is rare in research. I think that I now know why that is so, and I'm sure you can probably guess why for yourselves, my friends. But the truth is that despite the right-wing authoritarianism instrument still being used quite commonly in research today, very few studies are concerned with even Altmaier's own left-wing authoritarianism instrument, let alone the von Heel and updated measures that we've looked at tonight. And few remember Einsich's and Ray's extensive criticisms of the right-wing authoritarianism instrument when it comes to its modern usage. There is a common fault in research when an instrument becomes so ubiquitous that we forget its failures and faults, which in this case date back half a century. In the instance of the right-wing authoritarianism instrument and the F-scale upon which it is based, sure, we have plenty of research showing that the instrument is consistent. But what about its validity? I'm not so sure about that, and neither have been many scholars who over the last 50 years have questioned it as well. Yet, damn them if they propose the existence of a differentiated left-wing authoritarian system, one which seems to be easily identified by merely removing the religious elements from the existing RWA or F-scale measures.
I have no idea what you're talking about.
In summation, the left and the right are not direct dichotomies. They are not mirror images of each other, but distinct ideological stances. Yes, some of them may fall into what we may generally define as authoritarianism, or more conservatism or liberalism, and so on and so forth, but all of these are not seemingly identical. Right-leaning authoritarianism is based on deference to a leader figure, and a fear of change, while left-leaning authoritarianism is based on deference to a social group and its norms, and potentially also fear of change when your social group is in a position of power. While I do not agree on the XY axis of the political compass being absolutely, resolutely a correct way of measuring the ideology spectrum, it is surely a better start than the horseshoe-esque position from which those who have been debating the RWA and F scale in contrast to an existing LWA have been engaged in and preoccupied with for so long. Much like the internet, understanding political ideology is not something you just dump something on. It's not a big truck. It's a series of spectrums. And with that ancient meme, we come to our conclusion. What do you think about the concept of authoritarianism? Is it a horseshoe, or is it an aspect shared by those of any political ideology, simply manifested in different manners and different behaviors? Let me know in the comments below, and if you've enjoyed this video, please be sure to like and subscribe if you feel so inclined, and please, if you also feel so inclined, check out my Patreon or my merch store. I'm Aiden Paladin, Altana Volt.